My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 25 years old. Standing in our family driveway, I clutched my Tesla keys so tightly they left marks on my palm. My mother's voice rose to that familiar pitch that meant war was coming, while my unemployed brother Jake stood behind her with that entitled smirk I'd grown to hate. "You're being selfish, Sarah! He needs this car more than you do." Mom screamed, her face flushed with rage. Dad stepped forward, his hand already raised. "Give him those keys right now. Or else." When I shook my head and said no, his palm connected with my cheek with a crack that echoed through the neighborhood. That slap changed everything, but not in the way they expected. Before we dive into this story that changed my entire life, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and while you're there, please hit that like button and subscribe for more family drama stories that'll make your jaw drop. Trust me, what happened next will shock you even more than that slap did. Let's get into the chaos that followed. The sting on my cheek burned like fire, but the betrayal in my heart hurt infinitely worse. 6 months earlier, I'd finally achieved my dream of owning a Tesla Model S. After working 60-hour weeks as a software engineer at a tech startup downtown, saving every penny for 2 years, and skipping countless dinners out with friends, I'd walked into that dealership with my head held high and my bank account ready. The sleek black beauty sitting in our driveway represented everything I'd worked for, every late-night coding session, every weekend spent debugging instead of relaxing. But my family saw it differently. To them, it was just another thing that should belong to Jake, their golden child who couldn't seem to hold down a job for more than 3 months at a time. At 23, Jake had been unemployed for 8 months straight, cycling through excuse after excuse, while our parents enabled every failure. First, it was his boss who had it out for him at the retail store. Then the restaurant manager was playing favorites. The construction job was too physically demanding for someone with his sensitive constitution. Each time, Mom and Dad nodded sympathetically and handed him more money. The morning of the confrontation started like any other. I'd come home from my apartment to drop off some documents Dad needed for his taxes, planning to stay just long enough to grab lunch with Mom. Instead, I walked into an ambush that had clearly been planned in advance. Mom was waiting in the kitchen, her arms crossed, and her expression set in that determined way that meant she'd already made up her mind about something. "Sweetheart, we need to talk about your car situation," she began, not even bothering with pleasantries. "Jake has been trying so hard to find work, but he needs reliable transportation to get to job interviews. You live close to the subway, so you could easily take public transit to work." The audacity of the statement hit me like a physical blow. "Mom, I bought that car with my own money. I need it for work, for errands, for my life. Jake chose not to work for 8 months. That's not my problem to solve." Her face hardened immediately. "How can you be so selfish? We're family. Family helps each other out. Your father and I have always supported you, put you through college, given you everything you needed. Now it's time for you to give back." The manipulation was so transparent it made me sick. They'd supported me by doing the bare minimum required by law, while showering Jake with constant financial bailouts that I never received. When I needed help with college expenses, I was told to figure it out, and ended up working 3 part-time jobs. When Jake crashed his car junior year, they immediately bought him a replacement. Jake appeared in the kitchen right on cue, his timing too perfect to be coincidental. "Hey sis," he said with that lazy grin that had charmed our parents out of thousands of dollars over the years. "Mom told me the good news about borrowing your car. I've got 3 interviews lined up next week." "There's no good news, Jake. I'm not lending you my car." I kept my voice level, professional, the same tone I used in difficult client meetings. "You'll need to find another solution." That's when Dad entered the scene, his face already set in the stern expression he'd perfected during my childhood. "Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, I'm disappointed in you. We raised you better than this. Your brother needs help, and you're turning your back on family." The lecture that followed was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. Dad painted a picture of Jake as a struggling young man just trying to get his life together, while I was the successful, selfish daughter who'd forgotten where she came from. He conveniently omitted the part where Jake had blown through more than $15,000 of their money in the past year alone, or how Id never asked them for a single penny since graduating college. "I worked for this car," I said, my voice starting to shake with anger. "I saved for 2 years. I need reliable transportation for my job, which pays well enough that I can actually support myself instead of living off my parents." The words hit their target perfectly. Mom's face flushed red with rage. "How dare you speak to us like that? After everything we've done for you. What exactly have you done for me lately?" The question escaped before I could stop it, and I immediately knew I'd crossed a line they weren't prepared to forgive. Dad's face went dark. "Give your brother those keys right now, or you can find yourself a new family." "No." The word came out stronger than I felt. "I'm not giving him my car." That's when his hand flew through the air and connected with my cheek. The sound echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. For a moment, nobody moved. Mom gasped. Jake took a step backward. And I stood there, my face burning, my ears ringing, staring at the man who'd just shown me exactly how little he thought of me. "Pack your things and get out of my house," Dad said quietly, his voice deadly calm. "If you want to be selfish and ungrateful, you can do it somewhere else." I looked around at their faces, seeing no remorse, no shock at what had just happened, only anger that I'd dared to stand up for myself. In that moment, something inside me crystallized into diamond-hard resolve. I pulled my Tesla keys closer to my chest, turned around, and walked out of that house with my dignity intact and my future in my own hands. Madison's apartment became my sanctuary that first night, though sleep was impossible. My best friend since high school took one look at my face and immediately started making up the couch, asking no questions until I was ready to talk. When I finally broke down and told her everything, the fury in her eyes matched my own. "They actually hit you over a car." Madison's voice was incredulous. "Sarah, that's assault. You could press charges, but pressing charges felt like a nuclear option I wasn't ready to deploy. Instead, I focused on the practical matters of finding a place to stay and figuring out how to handle the fallout at work. What I didn't expect was discovering just how deep the conspiracy against me ran. 2 days after the confrontation, my cousin Emma called with information that made my blood run cold. "Sarah, I think you need to know what's been happening," she said, her voice nervous. "I was at your parents' house last week, helping Aunt Linda with something, and I accidentally overheard a conversation between your mom and dad." Emma's revelation hit like a sledgehammer. For months, my parents had been going into my old bedroom whenever I visited, and taking cash from the emergency fund I kept in my desk drawer. Small amounts each time, never enough that I'd notice immediately, but adding up to nearly $2,000 over the past 6 months. They were laughing about it. Emma continued, her voice disgusted. "Your dad said something about how you'd never miss it because you make so much money, and your mom said it was basically payment for all the years they supported you." The theft was bad enough, but the casual nature of their discussion made it infinitely worse. They'd been planning this Tesla situation for weeks, assuming they could guilt me into compliance while literally stealing money from me to fund Jake's lifestyle. Armed with this new information, I drove to my bank and requested account statements for the past year. What I discovered there made me physically sick. The missing cash from my room was just the tip of the iceberg. Somehow, they'd been accessing my checking account and making small withdrawals that I'd attributed to bank fees or minor purchases I'd forgotten about. The total amount stolen was approaching $5,000. But the worst discovery was yet to come. Emma had more information, gathered from family members who apparently saw nothing wrong with sharing intimate details of the plan to destroy my independence. "Your parents already told Jake he could have the Tesla," Emma said during our second conversation. "They've been promising him for months that they'd figure out a way to get it from you. The whole thing about job interviews was just an excuse. Jake's been telling people he's getting a Tesla for weeks. The premeditation was breathtaking. This wasn't a spontaneous request born out of desperation. It was a calculated campaign designed to separate me from my most valuable possession and hand it over to their favorite child. They'd been so confident in their ability to manipulate me that they'd made promises to Jake before even starting the conversation. The family pressure campaign began almost immediately. Uncle Robert called first, his voice carefully neutral as he explained that family comes first and that I should consider the bigger picture. When I told him about the theft, he fell silent for a long moment before suggesting that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding about the money. Aunt Patricia was next, taking a different approach by appealing to my emotions. Jake is really struggling, honey. Hes depressed about not having work, and having that car would give him the confidence boost he needs to really commit to finding a job. The calls kept coming. Grandmother weighed in with disappointment about my hard-heartedness. Cousins I barely spoke to suddenly had opinions about family loyalty and sharing resources. Each conversation followed the same script: minimize my concerns, maximize Jake's needs, and frame my refusal as a character flaw that needed correction. What struck me most was how coordinated it all felt. People were using remarkably similar language, hitting the same emotional buttons, and presenting identical arguments about family obligation. It felt less like genuine concern and more like a carefully orchestrated campaign. My suspicions were confirmed when Madison showed me something that made my blood boil. As a family friend who'd been included in various group chats over the years, she still received messages from the extended family chat where my parents regularly held court. "You need to see this," Madison said grimly, handing me her phone. The messages painted a clear picture of manipulation and conspiracy. Mom had posted detailed strategies for bringing Sarah around, including specific phrases to use and emotional triggers to exploit. Dad had shared information about my financial situation that I'd told them in confidence, analyzing my ability to afford the sacrifice. Relatives were assigned specific talking points and told when to call for maximum impact. Most disgusting of all were Jake's contributions to the chat. Head posted pictures of Tesla interiors with captions like, "Soon and can't wait to upgrade." He was treating my car like a guaranteed gift, counting on his parents' ability to manipulate me into submission. The final straw came when I discovered they'd created a secondary chat specifically for planning how to handle the Sarah situation. Screenshots showed detailed discussions about my personality, my weaknesses, and the best ways to apply pressure. They'd analyzed me like a target in a military operation, studying my psychology to find the most effective attacks. Reading those messages felt like watching my own family dissect me with clinical detachment. They weren't treating me like a person with valid feelings and rights. I was an obstacle to be overcome, a problem to be solved through the right combination of guilt, pressure, and emotional manipulation. The worst part was seeing how many people I'd trusted were actively participating in the conspiracy. Relatives I'd helped financially in the past were now plotting against me. Family friends who'd watched me grow up were sharing strategies for breaking down my resistance. Even some of Jake's friends had been recruited to make social media posts about his transportation struggles, designed to make me look heartless for not helping. That night, I sat in Madison's living room staring at the evidence of my family's betrayal, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. But alongside the hurt and anger, something else was growing. A cold, determined fury that would soon change everything. The psychological warfare began the next morning with a phone call that would have been almost comical if it hadn't been so cruel. Mom's voice came through my phone dripping with fake emotion, trembling with manufactured tears that I could practically see through the speaker. "Sarah, sweetheart. I've been up all night crying," she began, her voice catching in all the right places. "I can't believe you're doing this to our family. Your father is so stressed about this whole situation that his blood pressure is through the roof. Do you want to be responsible for giving him a heart attack?" The manipulation was so transparent, it took my breath away. She was weaponizing Dad's health, something Shed never mentioned being concerned about before, to guilt me into surrender. When I pointed out that his stress might be better managed by not stealing from his daughter and physically assaulting her, she gasped as though I'd slapped her through the phone. "How can you be so cruel? We never stole anything from you. That money you're talking about was payment for all the food, shelter, and clothing we provided for 18 years, and your father barely touched you. You're being so dramatic about a little tap on the cheek, gaslighting at its finest." My childhood support, which was literally their legal obligation as parents, was suddenly a debt I owed with interest. The assault that left a handprint on my face was minimized to a little tap. Reality was being rewritten in real time, and she expected me to accept the revision. Dad took a different approach when he called an hour later. Gone was the explosive anger from the confrontation. Instead, he spoke in the disappointed, paternal tone that had made me feel small and guilty throughout my childhood. Sarah, I've been thinking about our conversation the other day, and I realize we might have gotten a little heated. But you have to understand the position you're putting us in. We promised Jake that car because we believed you'd do the right thing. Now we look like fools, and he's questioning whether we have any influence with you at all. The audacity was stunning. They'd made promises about my property without my consent, and somehow their embarrassment at being unable to deliver was my fault. When I reminded him that they had no right to promise away something that belonged to me, his tone shifted to barely controlled frustration. That's where you're wrong, young lady. We co-signed the loan for that car. Legally. We have as much right to it as you do. This was a complete lie. I'd purchased the Tesla with cash from my savings, and my parents' names appeared nowhere on any documentation. But Dad delivered the falsehood with such confidence that for a moment, I questioned my own memory. That's the insidious power of gaslighting. It makes you doubt the evidence of your own experiences. The third betrayal cut deepest because it came from someone I'd always considered an ally. Grandmother had been my refuge during childhood, the one adult who seemed to understand me when my parents were being unreasonable. So when she called, I answered hopefully, thinking she might offer support or at least neutral advice. Instead, she delivered a lecture that could have been written by my parents. Sarah Elizabeth, I'm ashamed of you. Family is everything, and you're tearing ours apart over a car. I didn't raise your mother to have such a selfish daughter. If you don't fix this situation immediately, don't bother coming to see me anymore. The rejection from my grandmother hit harder than my father's slap. She'd been my emotional anchor for 25 years, and now she was cutting me loose for refusing to enable Jake's continued freeloading. Later, I'd discover that my parents had spent hours on the phone with her, painting me as a rebellious ingrate who needed tough love to learn proper family values. But the campaign didn't stop with family. Mom had apparently contacted several of my friends, claiming to be worried about my mental state and asking them to reach out with gentle interventions. Friends I hadn't spoken to in months suddenly started calling with suspiciously similar concerns about my recent behavior and suggestions that maybe I was overreacting to the Tesla situation. The most manipulative move came when Mom called my boss at work. She identified herself as my concerned mother and explained that I was going through a difficult emotional period that might affect my job performance. She painted a picture of a family crisis that was entirely my fault, suggesting that my colleagues should be patient with my erratic behavior as the family tried to get me professional help. Fortunately, my boss Jennifer was sharp enough to see through the manipulation. She called me into her office the next morning, not to discipline me, but to warn me that someone was trying to sabotage my career. I've been in management for 15 years, Jennifer told me, and I've seen family members try to destroy their relatives' professional lives before. Whatever's happening at home, don't let them drag your work into it. You're one of our best employees, and I'm not about to let family drama change that. But the damage was already spreading. Jake had taken to social media with a carefully crafted victim narrative that painted him as a struggling young man whose cruel sister refused to help despite having the means to do so. His posts were masterpieces of manipulation, complete with photos of him walking miles to job interviews and heartbreaking stories about missing opportunities due to lack of transportation. The posts went viral within our extended social network. Comments poured in from family, friends, distant relatives, and Jake's own friends, all expressing sympathy for his plight and disapproval of my selfishness. People who'd never met me were calling me heartless, greedy, and a disgrace to family values. What made it worse was Jake's skill at emotional manipulation. He never directly named me in the posts, instead referring to his successful family member who could easily help but chose not to. This gave him plausible deniability while making it clear to everyone who knew our family exactly who he was talking about. The social pressure became overwhelming. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me, whispers following in my wake. The grocery store clerk who'd known our family for years gave me disappointed looks. Neighbors who'd watched me grow up suddenly seemed cold and distant. Even strangers at coffee shops would recognize me from Jake's viral posts and make pointed comments about family loyalty. The psychological toll was enormous. I started questioning everything: my memory of events, my interpretation of my parents' behavior, even my right to own property that I'd worked for and paid for myself. The constant barrage of criticism and manipulation was wearing down my confidence, making me wonder if maybe they were right and I really was being unreasonably selfish. Late one night, as I sat in Madison's apartment reading the latest round of social media attacks on my character, I almost broke. The urge to just give Jake the keys and end the nightmare was overwhelming. It would be so easy to make the pain stop, to have my family back, to return to the comfortable illusion that they actually loved and respected me. But then I remembered the screenshots from their family planning chat, the casual discussions about manipulating me, the laughter about stealing my money. They didn't want resolution, they wanted submission. And giving in now would only teach them that enough psychological warfare could break me whenever they wanted something I had. That realization probably saved my sanity and my future. Instead of surrendering, I decided it was time to fight back with truth, evidence, and the kind of strategic thinking they'd underestimated in their target. The first unexpected ally came from within my own workplace. Dylan Rodriguez, a senior developer who'd always been friendly but never particularly close, approached me during lunch with a concerned expression that immediately put me on guard. I'd grown suspicious of anyone showing sudden interest in my personal life. "Hey Sarah, I hope you don't mind me asking, but I couldn't help overhearing your phone conversation with your family yesterday," Dylan said, his voice careful and respectful. "The things they were saying to you sounded really familiar." My defenses went up immediately. "Familiar how?" "Because I went through something similar with my own family 3 years ago," he replied, settling into the chair across from me. "Different details, but the same manipulation tactics. The gaslighting, the coordinated pressure campaign, the threats about family loyalty. It's like they all read from the same playbook." Over the next hour, Dylan shared his own story of family financial abuse and emotional manipulation. His relatives had tried to force him to co-sign loans for their failing business, using identical psychological tactics to the ones my family was employing. When he refused, they'd launched a similar campaign of character assassination and isolation. "The thing that saved me was documenting everything," Dylan explained. "Every conversation, every text message, every social media post. When you can see the pattern laid out objectively, it becomes obvious that it's not about love or family loyalty, it's about control and exploitation." Dylan's validation meant more than I could express. For the first time in weeks, I was talking to someone who understood that I wasn't being unreasonably stubborn or selfishly cruel. He recognized the manipulation for what it was because he'd survived it himself. Jennifer's support at work proved to be equally valuable. When she learned the full truth about my family's behavior, including the attempted workplace sabotage, she was furious. She'd built her department's culture around mutual respect and professional integrity, and my mother's interference was a direct attack on those values. "I want you to know that this company has your back," Jennifer told me during a private meeting. "Whatever your family tries to do professionally, they'll find that your colleagues know who you really are. Your work speaks for itself, and we're not going to let anyone undermine that." But professional support wasn't enough to protect me from the escalating campaign at home. My parents had moved beyond phone calls and social media to more direct tactics. They filed a false police report claiming I'd stolen the Tesla from them, apparently hoping that law enforcement pressure would force me to surrender the car to avoid legal complications. The police investigation was brief but humiliating. 2 officers showed up at Madison's apartment asking questions about my ownership of the vehicle, requiring me to produce documentation proving my legal right to the car I'd purchased with my own money. While the officers quickly realized my parents were lying, having to defend my ownership of my own property felt like a violation that went beyond anything they'd done before. "Your parents seem to think they have some legal claim to this vehicle," Officer Martinez explained apologetically. "We've looked at all the documentation, and it's clear you're the sole owner. But they're insisting they co-signed the loan." The false police report was a new low, even for my parents. they were willing to involve law enforcement in their manipulation campaign, potentially creating a criminal record for me over their lies. When the officers left empty-handed, I knew the retaliation would be swift and severe. It came in the form of Jake showing up at my workplace the next day, creating a scene that could have ended my career. He arrived during lunch break when the office was relatively quiet and started shouting about family betrayal loud enough for half the building to hear. "Sarah, get out here and talk to me like an adult." Jake's voice echoed through the lobby as security tried to calm him down. "You can't hide behind your fancy job forever. Mom and Dad are sick with worry because of your selfishness." The scene was designed for maximum professional embarrassment. Jake knew that causing a disturbance at my workplace would force me to choose between my family and my career. He probably expected me to rush out and agree to whatever he wanted just to make him leave quietly. Instead, I called building security and had him removed. Watching my brother being escorted out by guards while screaming about my cruelty was one of the most painful moments of my life, but I couldn't let him weaponize my workplace against me. Mrs. Chen, Madison's mother, emerged as my second crucial ally during this period. A retired family therapist with decades of experience in family dysfunction, she recognized the manipulation patterns immediately and offered to serve as a temporary guardian figure to help protect me from further psychological abuse. "What they're doing to you has a name," Mrs. Chen explained during one of our evening conversations. "It's called family scapegoating, and it's a form of psychological abuse that can cause lasting trauma if you don't have proper support." Her professional validation of my experience was enormously healing. She helped me understand that the isolation tactics, gaslighting, and coordinated pressure were textbook examples of family emotional abuse, not character flaws on my part. But even as allies emerged, new betrayals cut deeper wounds. Aunt Patricia, who'd initially been neutral in the family conflict, suddenly switched sides under pressure from my parents. She called with a tearful explanation about family unity and her obligation to support my parents' decisions, even if she personally disagreed with them. "I'm sorry, Sarah, but I can't be caught in the middle of this anymore," Patricia said, her voice genuinely regretful. "Your parents are my siblings, and I have to stand with them. I hope you'll understand and forgive me someday." The betrayal stung because Patricia had been one of the few family members who'd seemed to see through Jake's manipulation over the years. She'd privately expressed frustration with his freeloading and my parents' enabling. But when forced to choose sides, she prioritized family hierarchy over truth or justice. The pattern repeated itself throughout the extended family. Relatives who'd initially expressed support for my position gradually withdrew that support under pressure from my parents. Some offered apologetic explanations about not wanting to get involved in family drama. Others simply stopped returning my calls without explanation. The isolation was systematic and deliberate. My parents were using their position as family elders to force everyone to choose sides, making it clear that maintaining a relationship with me meant risking their own standing within the family structure. For most relatives, the choice was obvious: side with the established power structure, rather than the rebellious daughter. The legal consultation I sought during this period provided some comfort but also some concerning revelations. The lawyer confirmed that I had absolute legal ownership of the Tesla and that my parents had no claim to it whatsoever. However, she also warned that family manipulation campaigns could escalate to include more serious false accusations if they felt sufficiently desperate. "Document everything," she advised, echoing Dylan's earlier recommendation. "Keep records of every conversation, every text message, every social media post. If this escalates to the point where you need legal protection, you'll want a paper trail that demonstrates the pattern of harassment and manipulation." That advice proved prophetic sooner than anyone expected. Within days, my parents would cross lines that transformed a family dispute into something requiring serious legal intervention. Armed with legal advice and emotional support from my growing network of allies, I decided it was time to stop playing defense and start fighting back with the truth. Dylan had been right about documentation being crucial, and Mrs. Chen had helped me understand that exposing manipulation often neutralizes its power over victims. The first step was a deep dive into my financial records with Dylan's help. As a fellow software engineer, he understood data analysis and helped me create a comprehensive picture of my parents' theft over the past year. What we discovered was far worse than Id initially thought. Beyond the cash taken from my room and the mysterious checking account withdrawals, we found evidence that my parents had used my personal information to open credit cards in my name. The identity theft was sophisticated and had been going on for over 6 months. They'd been making minimum payments to avoid immediate detection, but the total fraudulent debt was approaching $12,000. This isn't family drama anymore, Dylan said grimly as we stared at the credit reports on my laptop. This is serious financial crime. Your parents have been systematically stealing your identity and your money while gaslighting you into thinking you owe them something. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented. Every fraudulent account, every unauthorized withdrawal, every forged signature was captured in bank statements and credit reports that painted a clear picture of criminal behavior spanning months. With Mrs. Chen's emotional support and Dylan's technical assistance, I filed formal complaints with the police, the credit bureaus, and the district attorney's office. The identity theft charges alone carried potential jail time that would force my parents to take the situation seriously for the first time. But I wasn't content to simply pursue legal remedies. Jake's viral social media campaign had damaged my reputation within our extended community, and I decided it was time to tell my side of the story with the same strategic thinking they'd employed against me. Dylan helped me create a detailed response that included screenshots of the family planning chat, copies of the fraudulent credit applications, and documentation of every manipulative tactic they'd used. The post was long, thorough, and backed up with evidence that told a very different story than Jake's victim narrative. For weeks, my family has been telling people that I'm cruel and selfish for refusing to give my unemployed brother the car I worked 2 years to afford. My post began. Here is what they haven't told you. While asking me to give up my transportation, they were stealing my identity and racking up $12,000 in fraudulent debt in my name. The response was immediate and dramatic. Comments poured in from people who'd been following Jake's posts, many expressing shock and outrage at the evidence I'd presented. Family, friends who'd been criticizing me publicly started deleting their comments and sending private messages of apology. But the most satisfying response came from Jake himself. Within hours of my post going live, he called in a panic, his earlier confidence completely shattered. "Sarah, you have to take that post down right now." Jake's voice was shaking with desperation. "You're making Mom and Dad look like criminals. People are starting to ask me questions I can't answer." "Maybe because they are criminals, Jake," I replied calmly. "Identity theft is a felony. Financial fraud is a crime. Everything in that post is documented fact." The conversation that followed was revealing in its desperation. Jake offered to find a job immediately, promised to pay me back for everything they'd stolen, even suggested that he could live without a car indefinitely. But notably absent from his pleas was any acknowledgement of wrongdoing or genuine apology for the months of manipulation and abuse. My parents' response was predictably more aggressive. Dad called that evening in a rage that made his earlier anger seem mild by comparison. "How dare you air our family's private business to the entire world?" he shouted through the phone. "You're destroying our reputation over money that we rightfully deserved anyway." The entitlement was breathtaking. Even faced with evidence of their criminal behavior, Dad maintained that they'd been justified in stealing from me because of some twisted sense of parental privilege that entitled them to my resources. When I pointed out that their actions were illegal regardless of their justifications, Dad's voice turned cold and threatening. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, little girl. If you think this is over, you're very wrong." The threat was ominous enough that I immediately forwarded a recording of the conversation to my lawyer and added it to the growing pile of evidence documenting their escalating behavior. But the real validation came from unexpected sources within the community. Local news picked up the story after my social media post gained traction, presenting it as an example of family financial abuse that experts said was more common than most people realized. "Young adults are particularly vulnerable to this type of exploitation," explained Dr. Rebecca Torres, a family therapist interviewed for the news segment. "Parents often feel entitled to their adult children's resources and will use emotional manipulation, guilt, and family loyalty as weapons to maintain control over their finances. Seeing my situation discussed by professionals on television was both vindicating and surreal. For months, my family had tried to convince me that I was the problem, that my responses were unreasonable, and my boundaries were selfish. Having experts validate that I was actually the victim of systematic abuse felt like emerging from an alternate reality. The news coverage also prompted other victims to come forward with similar stories. My inbox filled with messages from people who'd experienced comparable manipulation from their families, many thanking me for having the courage to speak publicly about financial abuse that often remains hidden. One message particularly stood out, from a woman named Rebecca who'd escaped a similar situation 5 years earlier. "Reading your story felt like reading my own experience," she wrote. "It took me years to realize that what my family did wasn't normal or acceptable. You're saving yourself years of therapy by standing up for yourself now." The community response gradually shifted in my favor as more evidence emerged and experts weighed in on the dynamics involved. People who'd initially criticized me started expressing admiration for my courage in standing up to systematic abuse. Even some family members began privately reaching out to express support, though most were still too intimidated by my parents to do so publicly. The legal proceedings moved faster than expected. The evidence of identity theft was so clear and well documented that prosecutors were confident about pursuing criminal charges. My parents suddenly found themselves facing the very real possibility of jail time for financial crimes they'd committed while trying to manipulate me into giving up my car. The irony was perfect. In their desperation to force me to give Jake my Tesla, they'd committed felonies that would likely result in criminal records, massive legal fees, and potential imprisonment. Their manipulation campaign had backfired spectacularly, transforming them from accusers into defendants in a criminal case they couldn't win. As I sat in my lawyer's office reviewing the charges that would soon be filed against my parents, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: a sense of justice being served and my dignity being restored. The transformation in power dynamics was swift and absolute. Within 2 weeks of the criminal charges being filed, my parents went from aggressive manipulators to desperate supplicants begging for mercy they hadn't shown me during months of psychological warfare. The first sign of their panic came through Aunt Patricia, who called with a carefully worded message that was obviously scripted by my parents. "Sarah, honey, your parents are really hoping you'll consider dropping those charges," she said, her voice nervous. "They realize they made some mistakes, and they're willing to make things right if you'll just give them a chance." The word mistakes was particularly galling. Identity theft, financial fraud, and coordinated psychological abuse weren't mistakes. They were deliberate criminal actions that had been planned and executed over many months. But the fact that they were finally acknowledging wrongdoing, even in minimized terms, represented progress. Dad's direct attempt at reconciliation came next, delivered in a phone call that perfectly demonstrated how quickly abusers can change tactics when their victims gain power. Gone was the rage and entitlement that had characterized all our previous conversations. Instead, he spoke in the humble, apologetic tone of someone who'd suddenly realized the consequences of his actions. "Sarah, I want you to know that your mother and I have been doing a lot of soul-searching lately," Dad began, his voice carefully controlled. "We realize we handled this situation badly, and we're hoping you'll give us a chance to make things right." The apology that followed was textbook manipulation, hitting every emotional button they thought might work. He acknowledged that the financial issues had been inappropriate while stopping short of calling them theft. He expressed regret for the misunderstanding about the Tesla, while avoiding any admission that they'd planned to steal it. Most tellingly, he focused on their suffering rather than mine. "The stress of these legal proceedings is really taking a toll on your mother's health," Dad continued. "She's been having panic attacks and can't sleep. We're not asking you to forget everything that happened, just to consider whether destroying your parents' lives is really the outcome you want." The emotional manipulation was so transparent it almost made me laugh. They were trying to make me responsible for consequences they'd created through their own criminal behavior. The same people who'd shown no concern for my emotional well-being while systematically abusing me were now demanding sympathy for the distress caused by facing justice for their actions. but the community response had shifted so completely in my favor that their manipulation tactics no longer held power. Neighbors who'd watched me grow up were expressing shock and disappointment at my parents' behavior. Local business owners who'd known our family for years were taking sides against them. The social pressure they'd tried to use against me had completely reversed direction. The nail in the coffin of their reputation came when Jake had a very public breakdown at the local grocery store. Overwhelmed by the collapse of his victim narrative and facing questions about his own role in the family's criminal behavior, he started screaming at anyone who would listen about how unfair the whole situation had become. "Shay's destroying our family over a stupid car," Jake shouted at the store manager, while other customers filmed the meltdown on their phones. "I just needed transportation to find work. Now my parents might go to jail because my sister is selfish and vindictive." The footage went viral locally, but this time the response was completely different. Instead of sympathy for Jake's plight, people expressed disgust at his continued entitlement and refusal to take responsibility for the family's criminal behavior. Comments poured in criticizing his inability to get a job despite being healthy and young, his expectation that others should provide for him, and his apparent lack of shame about his parents' theft. My lawyer was pleased with how thoroughly the narrative had shifted. "Your family's attempts at public manipulation have completely backfired," she explained during one of our meetings. "Instead of generating sympathy, they've demonstrated exactly the kind of entitled, manipulative behavior that supports your case." The legal victories kept mounting. Courts sided with me on every disputed point, from the identity theft charges to the restraining orders I'd requested after Dad's threatening phone call. The evidence was so overwhelming that my parents' lawyers were already discussing plea agreements to avoid the lengthy prison sentences that felony convictions might bring. But perhaps the most satisfying vindication came from unexpected sources within my extended family. Relatives who'd initially supported my parents started quietly reaching out with apologies and offers of support. Cousin Emma, who'd first warned me about the theft, became particularly vocal about her admiration for my courage. "I knew what they were doing was wrong, but I was too scared to speak up," Emma admitted during one of our conversations. "Watching you stand up to them made me realize that family loyalty shouldn't mean accepting abuse and criminal behavior." The shift in family dynamics extended beyond just my immediate situation. Other family members started questioning behaviors they'd previously accepted as normal. Uncle Robert's teenage daughter confronted him about lending money to Jake that was never repaid. Aunt Patricia's husband started asking pointed questions about why the family always expected her to support her siblings' poor decisions financially. My parents had maintained their position as family leaders through a combination of manipulation, guilt, and the implicit threat of cutting off relationships with anyone who challenged their authority. But seeing them exposed as criminals and manipulators had broken that spell completely. Suddenly, everyone felt permission to express frustrations and resentments that had been building for years. Jake's job prospects evaporated as the story spread through our local community. Employers who might have been willing to give him a chance before were no longer interested in hiring someone associated with such public family drama and questionable character. The car had been so desperate to obtain became irrelevant since no one wanted to employ him anyway. The professional recognition that accompanied my stance was unexpected but deeply gratifying. I received a promotion at work, partly based on my excellent performance, but also because my colleagues admired the way I'd handled an impossible family situation with dignity and strength. Jennifer made it clear that the company valued employees who demonstrated such clear personal integrity under pressure. Local newspapers featured my story as an example of how young adults could protect themselves from family financial abuse. I started receiving invitations to speak at college workshops about recognizing manipulation and setting healthy boundaries with family members. But the most meaningful victory was internal. The complete restoration of my confidence in my own judgment and worth. For months, my family had tried to convince me that I was selfish, ungrateful, and wrong to prioritize my own needs over their demands. Seeing their manipulation exposed and condemned by community authorities, legal experts, and mental health professionals confirmed that I'd been right to resist their campaign all along. As I sat in my Tesla that evening, the same car that had started this whole nightmare, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete freedom from the fear of my family's disapproval and absolute certainty that I deserved to keep the things I'd worked for and earned honestly. 1 year later, the legal proceedings had concluded with outcomes that exceeded even my lawyer's optimistic predictions. Both parents received sentences that included substantial restitution payments, community service, and probation periods that would last for 3 years. The identity theft charges alone had resulted in felony convictions that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The financial restitution was comprehensive, covering not just the money they'd stolen but also legal fees, credit repair costs, and damages for the emotional distress their campaign had caused. The court had been particularly harsh in their judgment because the crimes were committed against a family member who'd trusted them with personal information. This case represents a particularly egregious breach of family trust, Judge Rodriguez had stated during sentencing. The defendants exploited their parental relationship to commit systematic financial fraud against their own daughter while simultaneously attempting to gaslight her into believing she was the problem. Such behavior strikes at the heart of family relationships and cannot be tolerated by this court. The destruction of my parents' marriage was an unexpected but inevitable consequence of their criminal behavior. The stress of legal proceedings, combined with the public humiliation and financial pressure of restitution payments, had exposed fault lines in their relationship that had probably existed for years. Mom had tried to blame Dad for going too far with the identity theft, while Dad accused Mom of being the mastermind behind the manipulation campaign. Their attempts to deflect responsibility onto each other during court proceedings had been pathetic to witness and had probably influenced the judge's decision to impose maximum sentences. Jake's situation had become genuinely tragic, though it was entirely self-inflicted. The public nature of his breakdown and his continued refusal to take responsibility for his role in the family's criminal behavior had made him essentially unemployable in our local community. Had been forced to move back in with our convicted parents, creating a household of dysfunction that neighbors actively avoided. My own success during this period felt almost surreal in contrast to their downfall. The promotion at work had led to opportunities for advancement that might have taken years to achieve under normal circumstances. My reputation for integrity and strength under pressure had made me a sought-after team leader for high-stakes projects. The book deal that emerged from my experience was completely unexpected. A publisher specializing in family psychology and abuse recovery had reached out after seeing media coverage of the case. They were interested in a memoir that could help other victims recognize and escape similar manipulation patterns. Your story has all the elements that make for compelling and educational reading, the editor explained during our initial meeting. The systematic nature of the abuse, the clear documentation of escalation, and especially the successful resistance and recovery, provide a roadmap for other people trapped in similar situations. Writing about the experience was therapeutic in ways I hadn't anticipated. Organizing the events chronologically and analyzing the manipulation tactics with clinical detachment helped me process emotions I'd been too busy to fully experience during the crisis itself, but my parents weren't ready to accept defeat quietly. Even while serving their sentences, they made one final attempt to regain control over the narrative. They hired a private investigator to find compromising information about me that could be used to discredit my testimony or character. The investigation backfired spectacularly when the PI discovered additional evidence of their previous financial crimes that hadn't been uncovered during the original case. Bank records going back 5 years revealed a pattern of financial manipulation and theft that extended far beyond what they'd done to me. Apparently, they'd been systematically stealing from Jake as well, taking money from accounts he'd inherited from our grandfather and using his social security number to open credit accounts that he'd known nothing about. They'd also defrauded elderly relatives by claiming to invest their money while actually spending it on personal expenses. The new evidence prompted additional criminal charges that would likely result in extended prison sentences. More importantly for my peace of mind, it definitively proved that their treatment of me wasn't an isolated incident born from desperation about Jake's situation. It was part of a lifelong pattern of treating family members as financial resources to be exploited. Jake's reaction to learning about his parents' theft from him was revealing. Instead of anger or betrayal, he seemed primarily concerned about how the revelations would affect his already damaged reputation. His response confirmed that had been shaped by the same narcissistic entitlement that drove our parents' behavior. The extended family's response to the new revelations was swift and decisive. Relatives Hode maintained some sympathy for my parents immediately cut off all contact. The few family members Howd continued enabling their behavior suddenly found themselves isolated and criticized for supporting criminals. Grandmother's apology came through a handwritten letter that arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when I was least expecting emotional upheaval. Her elegant script, shaky with age but still recognizable, covered 3 pages of careful explanation and genuine remorse. "My dear Sarah," the letter began, "I have spent sleepless nights thinking about how wrong I was to doubt you and support your parents' terrible behavior. The evidence of their crimes has opened my eyes to manipulation that I should have recognized years ago. I was a fool to prioritize family loyalty over justice and truth." Reading her words brought tears I hadn't expected. Grandmother's rejection had been one of the most painful aspects of the entire ordeal because Id trusted her wisdom and loved her unconditionally. Having that relationship restored, even partially, felt like recovering a piece of my childhood that Id thought was lost forever. My dating life, which had been non-existent during the crisis, began to flourish as word spread about my strength and integrity. Dylan and I had developed a close friendship during the legal proceedings, and that friendship had gradually evolved into something deeper and more romantic. I've never met anyone who handled adversity with such grace and determination, Dylan told me during one of our evening walks. "Watching you stand up to systematic abuse while maintaining your dignity and compassion has been inspiring." The Tesla that had started the whole nightmare became a symbol of everything Id fought to protect. Id considered trading it in several times, wanting to distance myself from the memories associated with that confrontation in our driveway. But keeping it felt like a declaration of independence and a reminder that I deserved to enjoy the fruits of my own labor. As the first anniversary of the confrontation approached, I found myself in a position of strength and success that would have seemed impossible during those dark early weeks of family warfare. The question now was whether reconciliation with my parents was possible or even desirable after everything they'd done. 18 months after that fateful slap in our family driveway, my parents completed their court-mandated sentences and made their first tentative attempt at reconciliation. The approach came through my lawyer rather than directly, which immediately signaled that they'd finally learned to respect the boundaries Id established. The letter they sent was dramatically different from their earlier attempts at manipulation. Gone were the victim narratives, the gaslighting, and the emotional blackmail. Instead, they offered a straightforward acknowledgement of their crimes and a request for the opportunity to begin rebuilding trust through actions rather than words. "We understand that we have no right to ask for forgiveness," Mom's portion of the letter began. "Our behavior was criminal, abusive, and inexcusable. We are not writing to make excuses or to minimize the damage we caused. We simply want you to know that we recognize the full extent of our wrongdoing and are committed to spending the rest of our lives trying to make amends." Dad's section was equally direct and devoid of the self-pity that had characterized his previous communications. "The person who slapped you that day was someone I'm ashamed to have been. The man who stole from you, lied to you, and tried to manipulate you was a criminal who happened to be your father. I can't change what I did, but I can promise that person no longer exists." Their willingness to participate in court-mandated family therapy was presented not as a condition for reconciliation, but as evidence of their commitment to genuine change. The therapeutic process had apparently forced them to confront the narcissistic entitlement and manipulative patterns that had defined their parenting for decades. Mrs. Chen, who'd become like a second mother to me during the crisis, helped me evaluate whether engaging with their reconciliation attempt was emotionally safe. Her professional opinion was cautiously optimistic but realistically cautious. "People can change, especially when they face severe consequences for their behavior," she explained during one of our sessions. "The key indicators are whether they take full responsibility without making excuses, whether they focus on your needs rather than their own, and whether they're willing to rebuild trust slowly through consistent actions over time." My parents' behavior during our first supervised meeting met all of Mrs. Chen's criteria for genuine repentance. They didn't ask for immediate forgiveness, didn't minimize their crimes, and didn't try to rush the reconciliation process. Instead, they listened carefully to my description of how their behavior had affected me and accepted responsibility for damage they clearly hadn't fully understood. "We thought we were entitled to your resources because we were your parents," Mom said during that first conversation. "Therapy has helped us realize that being a parent means supporting your children's independence, not exploiting it for our own purposes." Dad's acknowledgement was even more direct. "I hit you because I couldn't accept that you had the right to tell me no. That makes me a domestic abuser, regardless of the family relationship. I understand why you can't trust me, and I understand that earning that trust back might take years or might never happen at all." Jake's transformation was less dramatic but more surprising. The collapse of his enabling system had forced him to confront his own role in the family dysfunction. After months of unemployment and social isolation, Head finally gotten a job in retail and was slowly learning to support himself. "I spent 23 years thinking I was entitled to whatever I wanted just because Mom and Dad always gave it to me," Jake admitted during a separate conversation. "Learning to work for things has been humbling, but it's also been the first time I've felt proud of myself in years." The restitution payments had been substantial enough to cover all my financial losses and then some. But more importantly, my parents had gone beyond the court-mandated payments to establish a fund for other victims of family financial abuse. The gesture demonstrated a commitment to making amends that extended beyond just our family situation. My professional life had continued to flourish in ways that felt almost surreal compared to the chaos of the previous year. The book about my experience had been published to positive reviews and was being used in college courses about family psychology and financial abuse. Speaking engagements at conferences and universities had developed into a secondary career that felt deeply meaningful. The Tesla that had triggered the whole crisis became part of my speaking presentations as a symbol of the importance of protecting your achievements from those who would exploit them. Id kept detailed records of every milestone in my journey to afford that car, and sharing that documentation helped audiences understand the real cost of giving in to family manipulation. Dylan and I had moved in together, creating the kind of stable, respectful relationship that seemed impossibly healthy after years of family dysfunction. He understood the importance of boundaries and independence in ways that someone who'd never experienced family manipulation might not appreciate. "You saved your own life by standing up to them," Dylan observed during one of our quiet evening conversations. "Not just financially, but emotionally and psychologically. Giving in would have taught them that they could manipulate you whenever they wanted something, and it would have destroyed your self-respect permanently." The extended family relationships that had been destroyed by the crisis had largely been rebuilt on healthier foundations. Relatives who'd initially enabled my parents' behavior had learned to recognize manipulation tactics and establish their own boundaries. The family dynamics were permanently changed, but in ways that felt more honest and respectful. As the second anniversary of the confrontation approached, I found myself in the unexpected position of considering whether limited contact with my parents might be possible. Their behavior during therapy and their consistent respect for my boundaries suggested that genuine change might be occurring. The decision to allow supervised visits felt like the completion of a circle that had begun with that slap in our driveway. But this time, the relationship would be built on respect, honesty, and clear boundaries rather than manipulation, entitlement, and exploitation. Standing in that same driveway 2 years later, holding the keys to a newer Tesla that represented continued success and independence, I felt something I'd never experienced in that location before: complete safety and absolute confidence in my own worth. 3 years have passed since my father's hand connected with my face in our family driveway, and the transformation in my life feels like stepping through a portal into an alternate universe where I'm valued, respected, and free to make my own choices without fear of retaliation. My consulting business, Mitchell Family Recovery Services, now helps more than 500 families annually navigate the complex dynamics of financial abuse and emotional manipulation. The work is demanding but profoundly fulfilling, turning my personal trauma into a resource that can prevent others from enduring similar suffering. Each client who successfully establishes boundaries or escapes exploitation feels like a small victory against the forces that once tried to destroy my own independence. The therapeutic journey has been essential to my healing, though it took time to find the right approach. Traditional family therapy assumes that reconciliation is the goal, but trauma-informed therapy recognizes that sometimes the healthiest choice is permanent separation from abusive family members. Learning to distinguish between guilt and genuine obligation has been one of the most valuable skills I've developed. Guilt is what abusers use to maintain control over their victims. Dr. Martinez, my therapist, explained during one of our early sessions. Learning to feel guilty about protecting yourself is how they program you to prioritize their needs over your own safety and well-being. The relationship with my parents has stabilized into something that resembles normal family interaction, though it's built on a foundation of strict boundaries and zero tolerance for manipulation attempts. They attend family therapy sessions monthly, participate in supervised visits quarterly, and maintain respectful communication through structured channels that prevent them from overwhelming me with demands or guilt trips. Dad's transformation has been the most dramatic. The man who once felt entitled to hit me for refusing his demands now asks permission before offering advice and immediately apologizes if he crosses boundaries. I've established. The change isn't just surface behavior. It reflects a fundamental shift in how he views parent-child relationships. I spent 50 years believing that being a father meant controlling my children's choices. Dad admitted during a recent therapy session. Learning that love means supporting your independence, even when I disagree with your decisions, has been the hardest lesson of my life. Mom's journey has been more complex because her manipulation tactics were more subtle and therefore harder to identify and change. But she's gradually learned to express concern without trying to control outcomes and to offer support without expecting gratitude or compliance in return. Jake's redemption has exceeded everyone's expectations, including his own. The collapse of his enabling system forced him to develop work ethic and self-reliance that our parents' indulgence had prevented him from learning. Has now assistant manager at a local electronics store and has been consistently employed for over 2 years. Having to earn everything I have has been humbling, but it's also made me realize how much I took for granted. Jake reflected during our most recent conversation. I spent 23 years expecting other people to solve my problems for me. Learning to solve them myself has been scary but also incredibly empowering. The original Tesla that sparked this entire crisis was eventually donated to a non-profit organization that provides transportation to abuse victims seeking services. The symbolic gesture felt appropriate, turning the object that had been used to manipulate me into a tool for helping others escape similar manipulation. My relationship with Dylan has grown into the kind of partnership I didn't know was possible before learning to set healthy boundaries. He understands that my independence isn't a threat to our connection, but rather the foundation that makes genuine intimacy possible. Watching him interact with my family demonstrates what respectful relationships look like when manipulation isn't involved. Your transformation has been inspiring to witness, Dylan told me during our engagement dinner last month. Not just the external success, but watching you learn to trust your own judgment and value your own needs. You've become the person you were meant to be before family dysfunction distorted your self-perception. The book about my experience, titled Breaking Free, A Guide to Surviving Family Financial Abuse, has sold over 100,000 copies and been translated into 12 languages. But more important than the commercial success are the thousands of letters I've received from readers who recognized their own experiences in my story and found the courage to establish boundaries or seek help. The speaking career that emerged from the book has taken me to universities, conferences, and therapeutic organizations across the country. Each presentation includes practical strategies for recognizing manipulation, documenting abuse, building support networks, and healing from family trauma. The work feels like turning my worst experience into my greatest contribution. Legislative advocacy has become another passion project. Working with lawmakers to strengthen protections against family financial abuse and improve resources for victims has resulted in meaningful policy changes in several states. The legal system that once seemed indifferent to family manipulation now has better tools for identifying and prosecuting financial abuse committed by relatives. Professional recognition for this advocacy work includes awards from victim rights organizations, invitations to serve on advisory boards for family violence prevention groups, and opportunities to consult with law enforcement agencies training officers to recognize family financial crimes. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition comes from former clients who send updates about their continued success in maintaining boundaries and building healthy relationships. Their messages remind me that the pain I experienced wasn't meaningless if it can help others avoid similar suffering or escape it more quickly. The extended family relationships that survived the crisis are now built on foundations of honesty, mutual respect, and shared commitment to preventing future dysfunction. Relatives who once enabled manipulation have learned to recognize and refuse requests that cross appropriate boundaries. Family gatherings are smaller but infinitely more peaceful and genuine. Grandmother's relationship with me has been fully restored, enriched by her understanding of how manipulation had distorted her perceptions of family loyalty. At 92, she's become one of my strongest supporters, and frequently tells other family members that my courage in standing up to abuse probably saved multiple generations from continuing patterns of dysfunction. The financial success that's accompanied this journey feels almost secondary to the emotional healing, but it's provided security and options that have enhanced every aspect of my life. The Tesla I drive now is newer and more advanced than the original model, but more importantly, it represents achievement that no one can take away from me through manipulation or theft. Looking back on that moment when my father's hand struck my face, I can see it now as the catalyst that forced me to choose between continued victimization and the difficult path of standing up for myself. The choice to keep my car keys that day was really a choice to keep my self-respect, my independence, and my right to benefit from my own hard work. The lessons learned during this ordeal extend far beyond family dynamics. I discovered that manipulation loses its power when it's exposed to light, that documentation provides protection against gaslighting, that legal systems can enforce boundaries when family relationships fail, and that genuine allies will emerge when you demonstrate commitment to truth and justice. Most importantly, I learned that loving yourself enough to say no to exploitation isn't selfish. It's essential. The people who truly love you will respect your boundaries, while those who react with anger or manipulation when you establish limits are revealing that they see you as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be cherished. For anyone currently experiencing family manipulation, financial abuse, or emotional exploitation, I want you to know that escape is possible, healing is achievable, and the life you build afterward can be more authentic and fulfilling than anything you've experienced before. The courage to protect yourself isn't cruelty, it's the foundation of all healthy relationships. The road to recovery isn't easy, and there will be moments when giving in seems simpler than continuing to fight. But every boundary you maintain, every manipulation you refuse to accept, and every step you take toward independence is an investment in a future where you're free to be yourself without fear of retaliation or punishment. That Tesla sitting in my driveway today represents more than transportation or success. It symbolizes the right to keep what you earn, to make your own decisions, and to build a life based on your own values rather than other people's demands. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is refuse to enable their dysfunction, even when they can't see it that way. The slap that started this journey was meant to force my submission, but instead it awakened my determination to never again allow anyone to treat me as less than I deserved. 3 years later, I can honestly say it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it forced me to discover strength I didn't know I possessed, and to build a life more genuine than any I could have imagined, while still trapped in patterns of family dysfunction. What started as a fight over car keys became a journey to reclaim my entire identity, and I've never been more grateful for the courage to say that one powerful word that changed everything. No. Now I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced family pressure to give up something you worked hard for? How did you handle situations where family loyalty conflicted with your own needs and boundaries? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story might help someone else who's struggling with similar challenges. Don't forget to hit that like button if this story resonated with you. Subscribe for more content about overcoming family dysfunction, and share this with anyone who might benefit from hearing about the power of setting healthy boundaries. Remember, choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary for building the authentic, fulfilling life you deserve. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and I wish you the courage to protect what matters most to you, no matter who tells you otherwise.